Back. Thank you very much for being here this evening, and thank you for attending our keynote address this evening as part of the conference marking the 100th anniversary of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. For those of you who are fortunate enough to be with us today at any point, I think you realize that there's a wealth of knowledge that's out there about the Archdiocese. There's a wealth of material to be studied, and there's lots of work still to be done. So if anything that this conference can do is hopefully can encourage continued research and work in the history of our Greek Orthodox Church and churches and archdioceses here in America. I would like to invite up to the podium His Grace Bishop Joachim, who will open the evening for us by offering some greetings from His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros of America. Unfortunately, His Eminence couldn't be here tonight. He was planning on being here. We had it on his schedule from a year ago, but the Patriarch of Alexandria is in town in New York, and so for that reason, he was unable to be with us tonight. But Your Grace, if you would come up and give his greetings, thank you.
Your Eminence, President Cantonis, faculty and students, keynote speaker Dr. Alexander Kitrov, distinguished scholars and participants, brothers and sisters in Christ. I am offering only a short greeting as I am currently in attendance here in New York to His Beatitude Patriarch Theodoros II of Alexandria and all Africa. As joyful as it is to welcome the Pope and Patriarch of Alexandria, the first one to visit the United States, I feel the loss of not being with all of you as you explore the significance and meaning of the centenary of the Sacred Archdiocese of America as an eparchy of the Mother Church of Constantinople. Having His Beatitude in our midst reminds us that the origins of our Archdiocese are bound up with a truly unique personage of our church, the late Patriarch Meletios Metaxakis. In one lifetime, he was in succession the head of the Church of Greece, then known as the Metropolitan of Athens, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and finally, the Patriarch of Alexandria. This remarkable figure in church history had a great deal to do with the formation of our archdiocese and with the course of orthodoxy in the 20th century and beyond. I commend all the participants for their offerings of scholarship and historical perspective, for we all need to understand how our church has come to its present moment in order to chart a steady and righteous course for the future. Although I am not with you in person at your proceedings, I look forward to receiving the fruits of your labors and studying your premises and conclusions. May the Lord bless all of your works, and thank you for your kind contributions to our centennial year festivities. Elpidophoros, the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace. I'd like to invite up to the podium now President, Mr. George Cantonis. But before you stand up, George, I'm going to take this opportunity to just say thank you. We came to you as a faculty a year ago and asked for your support for this conference, and without hesitation, you said absolutely, and you've only supported it from that time on forward. So we thank you. And also, just the fact that you were here all day was really a blessing, too. So thank you. We really appreciate it, because I know you have a busy schedule. So if you wouldn't mind coming up and saying a few words, thank you.
I was asked how long this was going to be, and I just showed this, and everybody relaxed. Your Eminences, Your Graces, Reverend Fathers, distinguished resident and visiting scholars, ladies and gentlemen, as president of Helena College, Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology, I'm delighted and honored to welcome you all to our campus for what I really do believe is a singularly important conference sponsored by the School of Theology on all the aspects of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, past, present, and I think most importantly, future. It is fitting that the wonderfully informative and evocative Centennial exhibition traveled to our schoolie from New York after the Clergy Laity Convention. It serves not only as a backdrop to the conference, but also visibly underscores the indissoluble connection between the Archdiocese and this institution, without which neither could really exist. As Father Tony Vrame likes to say, the school is where the church goes to think. My deepest thanks goes to Father Vrame, to Jim, who we're very proud to have occupying the Cantonist chair. Jim, we've been very proud of that. Father George Parsenios, the Dean of the School of Theology, for organizing and hosting this conference. I'm especially pleased that these proceedings are being live streamed. Emmanuel Demula, thank you all very much for your help in doing that. And also, I would always be remiss in not thanking Presbytera Chisula Kukundi, Executive Director of the Malliota Center, for having brought this amazing facility up to the standard that allows us to very proudly present these kinds of exhibits and symposium. May God continue to bless our sacred Archdiocese and our Archbishop, Elpidoforos, as they lead us into a bright new era of growth for our precious Orthodox faith in America. Thank you all for coming.
Next, I would like to invite up our distinguished and friend and colleague and dean, Father George Parsenios, and just to thank him as well for his support, because when he became dean and came on as dean a little over a year ago, the faculty had already voted for this conference, and so you sort of inherited the conference, but you've been very supportive of it, and we thank you very much. And if you wouldn't mind coming up and saying a couple of words.
Thank you, Jim. Your Eminence, Your Grace, Mr. President, and distinguished guests. It's a great pleasure to have you here on our campus and to learn about the Archdiocese in the context of the school. Because I was struck this morning, especially as I listened to the papers of Dr. Skedros and Dr. Kiru, by the amount of chaos that accompanied the arrival of the church on these shores when it came to filling churches with priests. It was an incredibly difficult task, and it was not always clear whether a priest was canonical. It was not always clear whether a priest was properly educated to serve a parish. And so it's fitting that we celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Archdiocese in this school, because the development of this school was critical for the development of the Archdiocese into a stable institution. In the 1930s, when the idea of a Holy Cross School of Theology was developed, the people who came up with that idea were great innovators. And we now have to carry forward their work as innovators. The temptation is to simply be caretakers of what has been passed down to us by generations of innovators who shared this jewel with us. We're trying very hard, though, not only to continue to do what the school has always done, but to take its mission into the 21st century by developing continuing education programs for priests, by developing online platforms for learning, and by doing a variety of other things. Because we understand the significance of this school for the health of the Archdiocese, and we're very grateful that all of you have come here to talk about the Archdiocese at the school. I simply also want to echo what the President has said to Jim and Father Tony. This has been a wonderful conference, and we thank you very much for all your work. You thanked me. I didn't do anything. You did everything, so thank you very much.
Before I introduce our keynote speaker this evening, I too would just like to echo some thanks, and thanks are really due to the president, to the dean, to the staff here at Meliodas, Cursula and Markella, who were really, really easy to work with and have been just extremely helpful. To the IT folks in the back, it's been super helpful to have you, Emmanuel and Damola, here, so thank you very much. And also to the faculty of Holy Cross for supporting this event. Professor Alexander Kitrov is Professor of History Emeritus at Haverford College. He is a native of Athens, Greece, and completed his high school and university studies in the United Kingdom. In 1986, he moved to the U.S. to pursue an academic career. In addition to his career at Haverford, he has taught at the Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies Center at Queens College, the Hellenic Studies program at Princeton University, the History Department at Temple University, the History Department and the Onassis Center for Hellenic Studies at New York University, and in his retirement is currently teaching courses at College Year in Athens, which is a familiar program to us here at Hellenic College and Holy Cross. His research and publications focus on nationalism and ethnicity in modern Greece and its diaspora, and its manifestations across a broad spectrum, from politics to sports. His publications are numerous, including books, articles, essays, and interviews. Among his several books are the following: Wrestling with the Americans, that could be a good title too. Wrestling with the Ancients, Modern Greek Identity and the Olympics. Elas, Ευρώπη Παναθηναϊκός, 100 χρόνια ελληνική ιστορία. The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt. The Greek Orthodox Church in America, A Modern History, which just came out in 2020, and I know for most of us that were preparing our papers for this conference, we've all had use of it. It's actually a marvelous book. I hope you do purchase it and read it. And then most recently, just recently published a couple of months ago, A History of the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, AHEPA, 1922 to 2002, A Century of Service. Professor Kitrov has also collaborated with film director Maria Iliou as a historical consultant in several documentary films, including The Journey, The Greek Dream in America, Smyrna, 1922, The Destruction of a Cosmopolitan City, and Athens, Between East and West, 1821 to 1896, which is the first of a 5-part series on the city's modern history. Professor Kitrov is currently working on a history of the Greek-owned diner restaurants in America. So quite a diverse interest. But on a personal note, I have known of Professor Kitrov for many years and his work. I've read his work, not all of it, but his works, and I had never met him until last night. I just have to say he is an incredibly generous, kind colleague, academic, and you can't always say that about all academics. So it's been a real pleasure to have you here, Professor Kitrov, and please join me in welcoming him. He will be speaking to us tonight with the title of The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese at 100. Professor Kitrov.
Yes.
Would you like a glass or is that?
No, it's okay. Let's choose this. So, yes, this to go ahead. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction, Jim. Your Eminence, Your Grace, Reverend Fathers, dear colleagues, friends, I am truly honored and humbled to be here this evening. I thank Jim and Father Tony for this conference and for being invited to talk to you. As you heard from the introduction, that kind and generous introduction, I am not a church historian. I am at most a social historian interested in the history of the Greek diaspora. And in my studies in the Greek diaspora, I came across a huge vacuum, a huge hole in the bibliography, which was the lack of history of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, the Greek Orthodox Church in America, and I had the boldness to write about it. And I will actually start my talk by telling you a little bit about how the book materialized, and then reflect on the history of the Archdiocese, the 100 years that I covered in the book, and which was covered so wonderfully in today's conference. In fact, I felt as if I was going through the book in my mind, listening to the wonderful presentations and saying, phew, I got that right. Oh, that, I didn't know that. Better use it for next time, etc. So in some ways you'll see there will be an overlap with what I want to say and what we've seen, what we saw during the day today. So I started, my dissertation was on the Greek community in Egypt. My paternal family originated somewhere from Greece, went up to Odessa, went to Chios, and then Alexandria. I was actually born in Athens, but for 3 generations my family was in Egypt, and I chose to do my doctoral dissertation on the Greek community in Egypt, and it's resulted in 2 books. And one of the chapters of the original dissertation was a discussion of the Patriarchate of Alexandria. The Patriarchate is a very, very important institution, but in contrast with the Church in contrast with the Church in America, the Church in Egypt was actually under the control of the community, which was run by the wealthy Greek cotton merchants. The community predominated over the church until the community in the end became too small, it lost its privileges, and that enabled the Patriarchate to gain the type of influence that it has today. I wasn't quite aware of the significance of that discussion I had. In other words, the fact that what existed in Egypt was different from the United States. But I was honored by recognition from my mentor, Professor Spiros Vrionis, who gave me my first academic job, my first long-term academic job at New York University at the Onassis Center. Spiros Vrionis was very interested in although he was a Byzantinist, he was very interested in the history of the Greek diaspora and on the history of America. This is one of his monographs, The Orthodox Church and Culture. And he also wrote a monograph about his own church in Memphis, Tennessee, and the struggles the church had over accepting the patriarchal regulations, the laws that we discussed earlier today, the changes, in other words, that Athinagoras did. It took a long time for the people in Memphis, Tennessee to accept the change that we'll discuss a little bit further on. So I'm indebted to Spiros Vrionis, but the actual book came out of my work with Maria Iliou and this documentary called The Journey, it's called The Greek American Dream, or The Greek Dream in America, which was generously funded by a number of the Jaharis Foundation, the Vagelos family, and other generous funders. And we had the premiere of the film in the United States premiere took place at the Metropolitan Museum in 2007. Archbishop Dimitrios was there, Senator Sarbanes was there, Mr. Michael Jaharis was there. It was quite a gala occasion. I remember afterwards that the official dinner was around the Egyptian temple at the Metropolitan. It was quite bizarre. But right after the film, two people came up to me and told me exactly the same thing. Write a biography of Archbishop Iakovos. It was Father Alex Karloutsas and the then General Consul of Greece, Katerina Boura. I knew Katerina from England. We were graduate students together. She went into the diplomatic corps, but she'd done a wonderful dissertation on the Greeks in Constantinople. Biography of Iakovos. Wow. I kind of thought about it and looked around, and the only reason I didn't dare do that, which would have been even bolder than writing a history of the Archdiocese, was there was no basic history of the Archdiocese. There were some books, there were some histories, but there wasn't a history of the Archdiocese that looked at the relations of the church with the community, which is really my field. I come from the history of the community rather than the church. And that interface had not been examined. And without examining that, I think one could not have written a biography of Iakovos and do him justice. I'm not sure you can do that anyway, but in any case, I decided instead to focus on a general history of the Archdiocese, the church. I stand on the proverbial shoulders of giants. Without these people, this book would not have been written. The Jaharis Family Foundation was extremely generous in enabling me to stay in New York and visit the archives of the Archdiocese, in which Miss Nikki Calais was the most wonderful, informed, helpful, and enlightened guide. Nikki Calais should write her own history of the Archdiocese as well. She is so experienced and had this close relationship working for Archbishop Iakovos. I also had the good fortune of Father Robert Stephanopoulos, who was retired, but he was still going down to the cathedral in New York, and there was a big library with his books, and I used to go down there once a week and hang out with. It was really hang out. You walked in there, and how you doing, brother? Father Robert was really wonderful as well in helping me, and many others who've written on the history of the Archdiocese. Fevrania Soumakis is here with us, a number of wonderful colleagues without whose work I would not have really been able to properly write the history. Let me start my reflection on the 100 years of the Archdiocese by looking at the 50th anniversary of the Archdiocese, which is in 1972. And this is a moment in which Archbishop Iakovos is recovering from the crisis of the language question, the crisis in 1970, when he was quite open about enabling the use of English in the liturgy, and there was talk about the some degree of autonomy of the church in America. There was a full-blown crisis. Essentially, it was the Greek born element in Astoria and its newspapers that was really trying to protest Iakovos' measures. Which were measures designed to align the church with the changing face of Greek America. That was one of what Iakovos successfully did. He came out of the struggle essentially a winner, although he had to, as the French say, he had to initially retreat in order to attack more effectively. He did that and came out on top. And therefore he gave a great emphasis. It was almost a celebration in 1972, and he calls it the double jubilee, to the ploi of Ileo, because Archbishop Athinagoras was made Metropolitan of Corfu, Kerkiras, in 1922. So Iakovos made sure that he would have a double celebration, linking the Archdiocese with the ecumenical patriarch. This is the celebration that took place after the publication of this book. It's the clergy laity in Houston, Texas in 1974, and tragically, during the clergy laity, Athinagoras, who had fallen very seriously ill a few days before, is taken by the Lord in circumstances which the newspapers describe as very, very emotional, because Iakovos stands up on the podium and announces this, and the whole hall breaks out in tears. People rush towards the podium. It must have been a singularly emotional moment in the history of our church. In the book, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Archdiocese, Iakovos does a decade-by-decade analysis. And that's what I do in my book, more or less. I go decade by decade. It's a very convenient way. And he looks at his predecessors, Alexandros, Athinagoras, Michail himself, and talks about the achievements, mentioning, of course, before Alexandros, Meletios Metaxakis, and somewhere else there is mention of Archbishop Damaskinos. As we heard today, Archbishop Damaskinos comes and prepares the way for Athinagoras to come in 1931. Iakovos talks about achievements. He uses the word in English, growing pains. He says his decades are a little bit off, but these are the decades he gives. 32 is a year into Athinagoras, but the point is well taken. The 1920s, growing pains for the Archdiocese because of the Venizelist royalist rift, but these growing pains are eventually overcome because Meletios Metaxakis had already connected the Archdiocese with the ecumenical patriarchate. Archbishop Alexandros, Iakovos says, and we had several references to Archbishop Alexandros today, and I think 100 years later, this is a good moment maybe to reassess an archbishop who's been overlooked, whose services may have been discounted. Iakovos says that he struggled valiantly, and every struggle has its end, and typo there has its victim. And he feels that Alexandros was a victim of circumstances which were the intense polarization that the Greeks had gone through. He talks about Athinagoras introducing an era of self-respect for Greek Orthodoxy, responsibility, union of all Greek Americans around the church, very accurate. They are now deciding to stay in America and create a church. And as Iakovos liked to do, he kind of metaphorizes. He says that Athinagoras oversees a passage from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. Iakovos was obviously very close to Athinagoras and an open admirer. And he recognizes Archbishop Michael from 1950 to 1960, of course, 59, Michael's era of transition to a new generation. He mentions Goya. He mentions the recognition of the church from the American authorities. And then he talks about his own beginning, the 1960s, a fifth decade in which the Greek Orthodox Church has to handle the fact that it is, as we will see further down, no longer an immigrant church, but a church that represents both Greek and Americans, Greek Americans. And there's little that one could pick and argue with Iakovos' assessment. I think I would agree. I think it's important to stress that Athinagoras brings the reorganization of the Archdiocese. The fact that the communities may be the most important, but we should not forget the creation of the National Ladies Philoptochos. There were Philoptochos organizations in churches even before the beginning of the Archdiocese, somewhat forgotten in our history, and Iakovos and Athinagoras' organization of a national body helps the local organizations coordinate, gain momentum, learn from each other, and go forward. The communities become parishes. We spoke a lot about it today. This is the difference with Alexandria that I noticed. In other words, the regulations that Athinagoras suggests are that, and it's very logical, the decade of the 1920s was a decade of polarization because the laity was split between Venizelists and Royalists. How are you going to solve that problem? You've got to push the laity aside, if I can put it that way, and have the church run its own affairs, insulate the church from the very intense Venizelist, Royalist polarization. So the Kynotita, which runs the church, is now going to become a parish, θα γίνει ενορία, and the community, the heads of the community can become part of the board of the enoria, but the enoria is headed by the priest. And as I said earlier today, we have the evidence of Greek ambassador to the United States, Charalambos Simopoulos, who says very clearly the Venizelist royalist polarization is not in the church. It's brought into the church by the laity. So this issue is addressed by changing the communities and making them into enorias. We have the National Council of Education. The church takes the huge responsibility of education and Greek language. It's a huge burden and an issue that's going to occupy the church throughout its history. It's a huge challenge. And at that time, it's not only the changes that Athinagoras does internally to strengthen the church, but at that time, the community organizations are somewhat weak. They're in crisis. We've had the Wall Street crash of 1929. People are in need. AHEPA's numbers go down. AHEPA has annual conferences. It doesn't have an annual conference in 1932. It's losing members. GAPA, the other organization, is even worse state than AHEPA. So coincidentally, Athinagoras' reorganization coincides with a time in which the other organizations are struggling to survive. And in fact, at that time, AHEPA, which was pursuing Americanization, because Americanization had succeeded to a great extent, AHEPA is turning towards the Hellenic traditions and Greek Orthodoxy. And mention was made of Athinagoras' visit to the White House. It's AHEPA members who meet Athinagoras in Washington and take him to the White House. AHEPA had a record of visiting the White House. So in a sense, that the developments of the 1930s are not only an internal strengthening of the church, but a strengthening of the church in the broader sense of its relationship with the rest of the community. This is just a parenthetical comment which I use to illustrate for most people, especially the Greek audience who knows the strength of the community in Alexandria, when I tell them that the community in Alexandria had the wealthy Benaki, Salvago, Horemi, Kazuli families, and those families, of course, were wealthy enough to control the church. But look at the difference in America. Here we have Hagia Sophia in Los Angeles, built or rebuilt by the Skouras family, one of the most important Greek and wealthiest Greek-American families. But the Skourases don't purport to create some kind of community organization and control the church. They can't help it. They'll create a mausoleum in the grounds of the church. Let's give them that. But they will allow the church to run its affair, and that's different. Emmanuel Benakis would not be as he'd want more of a say in the affairs of the church. Nothing to argue about with what Iakovos says about Archbishop Michael. We've had a wonderful presentation earlier today about Archbishop Michael. What I want to say actually is that the interesting thing with Archbishop Michael is not only that he does many good things, but he's in between Athinagoras and Iakovos, and we kind of forget him a little bit. He is presiding over the church over a time of many transitions. Athinagoras, at least, has stability in the community. Emigration has really stopped from the mid-20s onwards, and the community is just gradually, it's not, we don't have many Greek-born arriving, and the community is fairly steady. With the 1950s, as Theodore Saluto says, is the era of respectability. It's the era of upward social mobility. It's that second generation. It's the kids of the immigrants who are becoming Americanized. That is a problem for our church because they're becoming Americanized and joining the American mainstream, and the church has to try even harder to hold on to them. The complexity is even greater. There is a rise in religiosity in the United States in the 1950s. It's a spiritual reaction to the horrors of World War II. But that religiosity is expressed in that book, that famous book, which talks about Protestant Catholic Jew. Protestant Catholic Jew, something's missing. We are missing. So there's a religiosity, but the Greek Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox are being overlooked. So Michael has to work against those conditions, and especially with the upward social mobility. So he's got some challenges. And we have people coming in from Greece as well. So we have an increase in Greek-born people. And from World War II onwards, when the Greek-born arrive in the United States, they look at the church and they find they don't like it because it's obviously not like the church in the Choryo. So they complain about it. So there's always some tension when we have new immigrants coming in. So Michael's achievements are all those that we've spoken about and more, because he's got to deal with a fluid, changing profile of Greek America in the 1950s. If Michael had to deal with a changing profile of Greek America in the 1950s, Archbishop Iakovos, who comes in 1959, has an even greater number of social developments to deal with. I've got this kind of collage here. We've got the civil rights movement. We've got the junta in Greece, top right. We've got increased emigration from 1965 onwards. And we've got a kind of sense of modernity, which are displayed by the wonderful architecture of the church in Milwaukee. So there's a lot that Iakovos has got to juggle. With the civil rights movement, he makes the brave decision to march on the side by side with Martin Luther King, an exception. There is, I think, one more cleric who goes down with Iakovos down in Selma. The rest of the community don't do anything. There is one other big Greek-American organization that I won't mention, which celebrated the anniversary of Selma, and I'm saying, okay, everyone is celebrating the anniversary of Selma. Where were you in 1965? You were nowhere near Selma. Archbishop Iakovos was. And that stays as, I think, one of the most important moments of Greek Orthodoxy and the most instructive moments in the history of Greek Orthodoxy. The junta, we had a discussion over dinner about the junta. I will sum up. Archbishop Iakovos took the clergy laity to a conference in Athens in 1968 and received red carpet treatment. In the documentary The Journey, Father Robert Stephanopoulos has a wonderful phrase. He says, Iakovos had many achievements. He made some mistakes, but on the whole, that was obviously one mistake. But Iakovos disassociates himself from the dictatorship before its collapse. And as I tell audiences in Greece, it's not so much whether Iakovos was with the colonels, it's whether the colonels were with Iakovos. And when Iakovos saw that the colonels weren't responding to his, because he was trying to tell them to democratize, when they stopped listening to him, he sends a letter describing the dictatorship as a tyranny, and that's the end of the relationship. But it's obviously a difficult 7 years to deal with. The influx of immigrants in 1965, one of the intellectual leaders of this church, Nikon Patrinakos, has written very clearly about what I mentioned, the difficulties the church had with the Greek arrivals, that they saw the church wasn't like the church of their village and had difficulties in integrating in church life in America. And of course we have the modernization that's taking place, the Americanization of the community, which is now in its third generation. And this is when, in the 1964 Clergy Laity Congress, Iakovos lays out his mantra: we are no longer an immigrant church. We are a Greek-American church. And part of the issue of language that always seems to roil the history of the Archdiocese, the language question, first of all, Michael had allowed English in Goya in the 1950s. Iakovos allows a degree of English in 1974. It's inexplicable why in 1970, when there's an even greater opening towards towards Greek, there's such a furor. I think the problem's not the church or Iakovos. I think for Greeks generally, language is such a core of their identity that when they hear that there's going to be English in the liturgy, they somehow think that we're all going to be de-Hellenized on a Sunday morning, and that somehow resonates. Iakovos is very clear. I think if one could sum up Iakovos's long tenure in the church, his leadership is a very bold way of leading the church, adapting, retaining the Greek roots, but also adapting to American reality. A challenge. It could not have been easy. I don't think Iakovos made those decisions very easily. And this brings us to the 20th Clergy Laity in New York. It's when we have the big crisis over language. The Orthodox Observer is trying to prepare the Orthodox community for what is coming. The slide on the left is the June issue, our 20th Congress. Change or succumb to the inevitable. That's going to put it more clearly than that. I mean, and yet, then comes the next issue. Again, it's before. It's announcing the 20th Biennial Clergy Laity Congress, the most important conclave in the history of our church in the Americas. I mean, Iakovos was not shy about announcing those changes. It was when those changes happened that those reactions took place. 1984, I think, is the year in which Iakovos is at the apex of his influence. I must say, the 25th anniversary, the number of events that took place for the 25th anniversary seemed to be a little bit excessive. There was a music a performance in January in Alice Tully Hall in honor of Iakovos. This was in January. And then we had the big event at the cathedral. And there's an article that covers that event in the New York Times. And there is also an interview with Iakovos with a young journalist of the New York Times called Maureen Dowd. And I remember talking to Father Alex Karloutsos, and I said, wow, those 25th anniversary events, there was one after the other. It was impressive. And you know what? There was an article by Maureen Dowd, who now is this famous columnist. And of course, I got the kind of Father Alex look, and he said, who do you think arranged that? I drove down to the Times offices and brought Maureen down to see the Archbishop. A lot of it was orchestrated, but a lot was the response of the community was huge. And it was, and in a sense, as always with Archbishop Iakovos, there's excess, but there is also, one can recognize that there is someone rightfully celebrating his achievements. By then, it's very, very clear that the Church is the most important institution, not only in Greek America. I would say by now it's the most important institution in the Greek diaspora. Iakovos can pick up the phone. Maybe it's Father Alex who picks up the phone and gives it to Iakovos. They can communicate with the White House immediately. They communicate with Karamanlis in Athens. And most importantly, they can even communicate with Andreas Papandreou, the socialist leader who was in power in the 1980s, who he and Iakovos did not have a very good relationship. But soon as the Turks announced the pseudo-state of the north, Iakovos went to Athens and met with Papandreou. So it was a sign of the strength and the importance of Iakovos as a leader of the Greek diaspora by the mid-1980s. I didn't know that Dr. Papanikolaou was going to talk about this document. There have been many instances in this conference where people have said we didn't arrange things. I believe this is the document that was being discussed, and I have a different take on this document. It's a report to His Eminence Iakovos concerning the future theological agenda of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. It is submitted at the 30th Biennial Clergy Congress in July 1990. First of all, for me, this is a sign of the maturity and the leadership of the Church. There is no other Greek institution. There is nothing in the newspapers. There is no sustained study of the future of Greek America. There's very little sociological work. It's only sociologist Charles Moskos who's involved in producing this document. No one else is reflecting on what is ahead for Greek America as the 20th century is ending and the 21st is appearing on the horizon. That is the first thing. The second thing is Charles Moskos is very, very strident and militant in his report because he believes the Church is not a diaspora anymore. It's the Greeks are now Greek Americans. They're Americans of Greek descent. And I think this is a misunderstanding that has led to, which involves somehow the Orthodox Christian laity. Let me try and explain this, that in terms of the relationship of the ecumenical patriarchate is responsible for the churches in the diaspora. That is what exists. When Charles Moskos tells you we are not a diaspora, and we are Greek Americans, I see no contradiction in that. In other words, the Church uses the term diaspora in a different way. The Church uses diaspora. I think the writing is the Greek Orthodox beyond the jurisdiction of the 5 patriarchates. That's the diaspora. Moskos worries and says, no, we are not a diaspora, not because he's worried, he's using the secular Greek state. The Greek state calls you a diaspora because it wants to control you. They say, η ελληνική διασπορά, Έλληνες του εξωτερικού, you're the diaspora, we are the national center, we'll tell you what to do. So there's a different terminology. The Church uses diaspora differently. So Moskos was upset with the use of diaspora, but not the ecumenical patriarchate's use of diaspora, but the Greek state's use of diaspora. And I think that this leads to this issue. In the 1980s, early 1990s, we have the emergence of Orthodox Christian laity. Again, I see this as part of the intellectual ferment within the Church. Looking at things as a historian of Greek America, I see the Church coming up with long reports, coming up with groups that have alternative policies, thinking about the future. Everyone else seems to be spinning their wheels. They're doing the same things. I've studied other Greek American major organizations. It's like Groundhog Day. They've been doing the same things over and over, and they're not looking ahead for the future. The irony is the Church is so involved in the future, wanting to preserve its history and its identity, that obviously you're going to have people coming up with ideas, different ideas. You can have a group maybe more radical or a group pushing things more than the mainstream. But as far as that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is vibrancy, that is intellectual vigor, that's reflecting, that's being alive rather than just hoping that if you do the same things, nothing will change. In a society which is changing dramatically, in a community that's changing a great deal. Talking about pushing change too quickly, this brings us to the events in Ligonier, Pennsylvania in 1994 that precipitates the resignation of Archbishop Iakovos after 2 years in the summer of 1996. Ironically, the magazine on the left, which comes out before Ligonier, has an exclusive interview, The Epic Reign of Archbishop Iakovos. But what's going to happen right as this magazine is appearing in the newsstands, we have the Eastern Orthodox churches gathering together in the Antiochian retreat in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, to discuss their future, to discuss the way that they will react to gradually or rapidly Americanizing constituency. And the idea is that we will think about unity, think about an American church, think about a degree of autonomy. Somewhere these messages get lost in translation. There is, if you look at the fine print in the literature, it apparently the leader of the Ukrainian church either misread or something got lost in translation. The wires got crossed, and the ecumenical patriarch decided that the process was going too fast, and wanted to make sure that the ecumenical patriarchate would be in on whatever the changes would take place. A bit of an exaggerated cover of the Assis, that's Mr. Castanas's magazine in Astoria, Oristiki Rixi, final rupture. Well, that's what you put on your cover, of course, to sell the magazine in Astoria. But there was also coverage in the New York Times over that event. I think, again, this was a symptom of trying to respond to the changes and to the Americanization of the Greek American community. And in this case, maybe Iakovos wanted to push faster than the circumstances allowed. And we come to the farewell liturgy at Central Park in 1996, a momentous event. It's Iakovos' farewell. For some reason or another, the weather is awful, but thousands of people appear in Central Park. And again, I'm standing kind of out of the process and saying, for better or for worse, the Greek archbishop who is stepping down has decided to have a farewell ceremony in Central Park. A bit excessive, but okay. What's happening? Bad weather, thousands of people are present. Huge coverage in the media. Again, huge coverage in the media. A reminder to the American public of the presence of Greek Orthodoxy, of the strength of the Greek Orthodox, and especially their presence in New York City. I mean, farewell liturgy in Central Park, I mean, think about it. How many leaders of churches have held farewell liturgies in Central Park? I think only one, I don't know. And that's our Archbishop Iakovos. I think what's happening at the time is a very important change outside America. We have the so-called era of globalization. There's a wonderful article in the New York Times that talks about the era of, this is post-Cold War, globalization, transnationalism, all those words we hear. That phenomenon that takes place after the Cold War is one in which we have the increase of transnational organizations. The ecumenical patriarchate becomes more important. The world is not divided into East and West anymore. It's a transnational global world, and that allows the ecumenical patriarch to become stronger at the time. Diasporas become stronger at the time as well. So in some senses, the ecumenical patriarchate, right at the time when Legania was taking place, was actually becoming more important. This is a 1994 article. AHEPA, the major Greek-American organization, embraces the ecumenical patriarchate. They start visiting the ecumenical patriarchate every year. This plaque is at the entrance of the AHEPA offices in Washington, D.C. There's nothing else. There's just this one plaque commemorating Patriarch Bartholomew. So that is a big change which is going to affect Greek Orthodoxy. The fact that the ecumenical patriarchate is becoming stronger, is becoming more relevant in a transnational world. The end of the resignation of Archbishop Iakovos is followed by the I'm calling it the post-Iakovian era. There was a wonderful volume that Holy Cross published a long time ago called and someone, I think Father Efthimiou, talks about the Iakovian era. This is the post-Iakovian era. We have Archbishop Spiridon and we have Archbishop Dimitrios. Again, we had two extremely good presentations on both those archbishops. I think when I think of making an assessment of both Archbishop Spiridon and especially Archbishop Dimitrios, I remember the Chinese communist leader Chu Enlai, who was asked at one point what he thought of the French Revolution of 1789. And Chu Enlai responded, "It's too soon to tell." I think in many ways, and speaking as And speaking as a historian, I think we have to really remove ourselves from this era to make an informed and all-round judgment of both these prelates who served in many ways very competently. My favorite moment with Archbishop Spiridon is the commission he does about the Greek language, which is published in this book called The Future of the Greek Language Culture. And he has John Rassias, who's seen here. John Rassias is a Dartmouth professor who has a particular expertise in teaching foreign languages. And that remains an important contribution. Again, at the risk of sounding repetitive, do you think any other Greek-American organizations bothered to come up with a report about preserving or doing something about the future of the Greek language? No one. We have that commission that took place. And Archbishop Dimitrios, I think Archbishop Dimitrios calms the waters after a turbulent time. I think Archbishop Spiridon, I mean, who could have filled in Iakovos's position? A very, very challenging task he had ahead of him. There was turbulence in the church, and Archbishop Dimitrios, on the one hand, calms the waters. On the other hand, as was mentioned in today's presentation, which I totally endorse, I think played this important role with the events of 9/11, which of course were connected with St. Nicholas. Now, again, St. Nicholas National Shrine, the one thing I hear no one mentions about St. Nicholas, we all hear about St. Nicholas. Why have Calatrava do the dome, the money, what happened, the process, all the background stuff? For me, the most important thing is that the Greek Orthodox Church establishes something called a national shrine. A national shrine. Less than 100 years after the establishment of the Archdiocese, the Church doesn't limit itself in just rebuilding a church, but does something much bigger, much broader, that shows the fact that it sees itself as part of America, and makes this wonderful move of having something that is open to all religions. It's an Orthodox Church open. It's a national shrine. If that's not a sign of confidence and maturity of the Church, I don't know what is. And it pains me when I read all about the scandals and everything else, and we've got this national shrine here in one of the most important, sacred and iconic and symbolic places in American history. We are into a new era. The Chu and Lai dictum, of course, holds, but I think we all know, we've seen a lot of signs that we may well be looking at a new type of Iakovian era. The new Archbishop has had to overcome many problems and has responded in ways that have underlined the significance of the Archdiocese. As you heard, I've been studying the history of AHEPA, the support AHEPA has been giving to Archbishop Elpidophoros is really quite impressive. The Archbishop himself went to the Black Lives Matter march, and we're going to leave that to future historians, but we may well be living in, I think, a new era for our church. What else can we do as we reach the 100 years and reflect? Well, plus ça change, as the French say. Plus ça change. It's youth and education. This is from the Greek language, the Ethniko Kyrika. It's the last clergy laity of Archbishop Iakovos in 1996. Κατακτήσατε το μέλλον, ζητάει ο Ιάκωβος από τους νέους της ομογένειας. conquer the future, he asks from the youth of Greek American youth, and that is our perennial issue. The churches, these are photographs from the parade in Philadelphia. This is where the church, this is the issue that began with Michael in the 1950s, and as we pause to look back on the 100 years of the Greek Orthodox Church, I think we have this issue of youth and education. If there's one continuum from Michael onwards, is the need to be focused on the future and the youth. And the Church, I think, is aware of that, but the challenges are very big. And I think we all need to be attentive to that. How to close? I have a favorite passage from John Rassias's text, The Commission on the Greek Language. Rassias is a visionary, and he's talking about Greek American education, and I think he's talking about this institution, Hellenic College, Holy Cross, that's organized this wonderful conference that has given us the opportunity to reflect on the 100 years of Greek Orthodoxy. And Rassias says, let's build Greek education, let's build an institution which will stand proudly next to a Catholic Georgetown, a Jewish Brandeis, and a Quaker Haverford. And my hope is that with this conference and what we've done today and tomorrow and in the future, that we will build a Greek Orthodox educational institution which will stand proudly next to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kitroev. If you wouldn't mind, would you entertain
Absolutely,
questions?
yes.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Yes.
Do you want me to field them, or do you want to field them?
I can.
Very good.
Yes.
Thank you.
I just put my last slide up for future research for those of you who are church historians. So let me put a footnote to my talk. This is this is the book that the Baltimore parish produced. My book was top-down. I looked at clergy, laity, and archbishops. I couldn't do anything else if I was going to cover 100 years. I looked at many websites of parishes. People have done very, very good work. Some people have done books, huge books. This is the Baltimore book, the Los Angeles book, 2008. They was established in 1908, so in 2008, huge book. Parish history is a whole new, is an area that the church needs to cover. It's very, very important. The actual archives, this is from the Evangelismos in Philadelphia that was in downtown and then went out to Elkins Park. This is a baptismal record. This was my first encounter when I went to Alexandria to the Patriarchate. I looked at the baptismal records, and I saw that the baptismal records have name of father, origin of the father, name of the mother, origin of the mother, name of the anadochos, origin, sometimes the professions. The church archives, when we say the history of the church is the history of Greek America, that's where it is. The history of Greek America is in the church's archives. The church's archives reflect something much more than the number of christenings. It tells you the history of the community. Okay, that was my footnote. Yes, Father Tony.
Thank you. This is great, and I'll endorse the book too. So thank you very, very much. It's good to review all of this. My question is, and again, maybe it relates to the last slide of how the church, kind of in a knee-jerk reaction, embraces those people that it feels most comfortable with, whether they're Greek immigrants, the Greek speaker. but somebody who's at the margins of the community or much more assimilated or something like that always seem to be on the outskirts at times. How, as the church continues to acculturate, and it is as we speak, continue to kind of navigate through those waters? How do you see it from the past? How does it instruct us for moving forward?
I'll go back to Iakovos, who spoke about the church being an American church. And what he meant by American church wasn't that it wasn't Greek Orthodox or Greek oriented, but a church that feels that it's part of the mainstream of society, that in other words, it goes out confidently without there was a lot of talk of parochialism earlier today. That's what you've got to get rid of, that parochialism, that fear that papades will be looked at differently and teased maybe because their dress is different. The church should behave as if it's part of the mainstream. And in that sense, yes, the easy solution is to look for the immigrants, look for the Greeks. But just look at the numbers. Look at the declining numbers of Greeks. From 1974 onwards, you don't have the arrivals go down dramatically. There was a little, the so-called brain drain has all gone to Europe. They haven't come here, very few. I mean, there's been a little, but nothing much. So the demography is not in favor of the strictly Greek element anymore. So the church has just got to open up. And, you know, I think based on the 100-year history and its achievements, it has every right to be able to do that. How you do it, you are the practitioners who will. I can sit on the sidelines as a historian and wag my finger and say, you are an American church. Do it. Yes and yes.
I think there is a deeper issue that we're facing, despite a century of great successes. It was a century of growth and stability. We don't have the benefit of that. We're in severe decline now. But my observation, just looking at Orthodoxy, has been successful in many, many different environments. But wherever the Orthodoxy went, it slowly changed the culture. And wherever there are Orthodox in some kind of majority, you have the same culture. Doesn't matter that's Russia, that's a Greek village, Romanian village, Alaska. It's the same culture. It's very different from Western culture. We're faced here with an extremely solid Protestant culture in this nation. It's not going to change. So the question is there a way? Can we have a church that continues to inspire and even welcomes Americans without somehow imposing, like it has done other parts of the world, its culture? We're too small to change the culture here. We're not going to change it. So how are we going to manage to find a new model where the Orthodox Church is strong and yet can function within a foreign culture?
How long do I have to answer that? To be serious, yes. And I think looking at the 100 years, there's a point in which the church has turned towards trying to get as much support within the Greek American community, and then at some point it reaches whatever level it's reached by attracting Greek Americans and other Greek Orthodox, and then it has to look beyond that, and that is a huge challenge. But it depends how you treat that Protestant, that majority. Is it really a kind of closed Protestant majority, or is there enough spaces in it and enough tolerance and enough language of inclusiveness and multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity? I'm sounding like a liberal whatever now, but those elements of society, in other words, America as a country accepts the issues the principles of multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism. And I think you work through that.
I mean, I totally agree that Americans are open. It's just that whoever embraces that takes their shape. So even Catholics in this country are less Catholic than in South America or Europe in culture. They become very much influenced by the Protestant culture. And we're much smaller than the Catholics.
Yes. So I'll tell you a story. There was a religion professor at Haverford College, actually Greek, John Lardas. He then went on to Franklin and Marshall. And we were talking about students, and he said, you know what? He said, my Jewish students have a very Calvinist attitude to their work. I had to look up. I said, what do you mean? And which is, you know, the fact that those students had this kind of Protestant work ethic and were working very hard. And I think that might be, I think identifying the problem is the beginning. I was struck by that statement, and I think if you. So if you. So if you identify the problem, you know, the Jewish students are Calvinists. So then we have to, think about if we're the Jews, we've got to kind of debate that, discuss that, and maybe bring the idea of learning about Protestantism more clearly. Athenagoras talks about congregationalism in the clergy laity of 1931 when he's putting all the changes. I'm wondering how many people can know what congregationalism is when Athenagoras talks about it. I don't want to say know their enemy, but you know what I mean.
Thank you.
Vincent. The microphone's.
Excuse me. When you, if you could clarify a little bit more for me, or perhaps I lost it in the lecture, when you talked about globalization at the beginning of the 90s, especially during the Clinton era, suddenly the schism or the break comes with these very fantastic, with Odyssey magazine and Assis magazine, showing the break between Bartholomew and Jacobus. What was the issue?
So the issue is, so the idea is we're all American. We need an American Orthodox Church. The Patriarchate in Constantinople, what's that got to do with us? That's their logic.
Okay.
And the irony is that because of globalization and transnationalism, the Patriarchate in Constantinople, which in any case is important, is actually now becoming an international player because these organizations get enabled. And so we have the rise. I mean, a lot obviously has to do with the Patriarch Bartholomew himself, but I think the international circumstances are such that they've made the way that the Pope as well has become more. So that's the so when you're saying we are Americanizing, it's like the Catholics saying we're Americanizing. What do we need the Pope for? And meanwhile, the Pope has become more relevant internationally because of networks, etc. It's an irony.
This is a speculative question.
Oh, good.
And if you don't want to answer, that's fine. Would you mind speculating on what it might have looked, what might the Archdiocese have looked like had the 1908 Tomos never been rescinded and we had been part of the Church of Greece? Do you think the Greek American Church would look different today?
Yes, and I love the what if questions. They're great because they make you kind of think, put yourself back in history. So the church here would have been under the Church of Greece. So the problem with the Church of Greece is that it's under the Greek government. And therefore you have Theoklitos, who is this royalist, and then he's out, and then he's in, and then he's out again. I actually think that the church in the 1920s under Venizelos, it's the time when they send Damaskinos and then Athinagoras, the church has taken a step back from being politicized, but it gets repoliticized in the late 30s. Actually, Damaskinos, Damaskinos was appointed by Metaxas. It was Chrysanthos of Trapezunda, who was Archiepiscopos Athinon. So I think the church would have been much different. I think it would have been more divided. You can almost wonder whether you'd have an alternative church, the way you had, the Konvopoulos and those people, and then you would have had a fragmented Greek Orthodoxy. I think it wouldn't have been as strong. I think the Athinagoras arrival is, because Athinagoras increases the connection with the ecumenical patriarchate, pivotal.
Any other questions? Take one more.
I've taught canon law for over 20 years at the Antiochian House of Studies. Usually I have about 100 people in the class when I'm teaching canon law. I would say close to 70 to 80% of them are converts to Orthodoxy. Now the question of conversion is an interesting one. How do you judge conversion? How much does someone convert? Is someone fully converted? And I think one of the criteria that you have to use is what is essential about Orthodoxy and what distinguishes it from Protestantism and Catholicism. And from my experience, I think that deals with the focus of the church community. Is it focused on a culture? Is it focused on a language? Or is it focused on something more essential? And I think that really addresses the issue of whether you have genuine conversion or someone that is going through the motions of acculturalization and retaining many ideas that are foreign to the church's thinking. And so in the case in what I've experienced, I think I've experienced in the students that I've dealt with a genuine conversion in most cases, and it is reflected in a very vibrant orthodoxy expressed in the medium of American culture, and in a language that is understandable to the people of this land. So I would describe that as an American church rather than one that is seeking a solution in acculturalization. I think that it's the difference. I think you can have a Protestant church with icons, and I think you can also have an Orthodox church expressed within the medium of this country. And just an observation I wanted to address. I don't think we should fear the fact that we are a religious minority. I think that if we have a confidence that we have a truth and that we are incarnating the truth in this country and we are called to baptize this country, I think we should trust in the presence of the Holy Spirit within our church that we will convert people, we will bring Christ to them. And I truly believe that we will convert people. But anyway, I wanted to present that as an observation.
Thank you. Yes. Please.
Just you mentioned the Antiochians. I think I might be the only Antiochian person here. I The Antiochians have their. We have our own problems. We are by no means free of our own issues. But I will say, some of the issues that people have been talking about today of like, how do we be this Greek Orthodox Church in America in this changing context? And I'm thinking like, we have a bunch of other Orthodox churches in this country that are dealing with basically the same set of challenges, and some of them have got solutions. And and part of the problem is sometimes we become very siloed, and so we don't look at like, okay, so the Antiochians. I'm Antiochian. My family's all from what is now Lebanon, originally Ottoman Empire. We were all part of the Ottoman Empire once upon a time, right? And we came to America at the same time a lot of the founders of this archdiocese did. Antiochian Archdiocese created at the same time as the Greek Archdiocese, right? The Antiochian Archdiocese, and I'm not trying at all to say the Antiochians are some kind of model, because we, like I said, just look us up right now. We're a dumpster fire. But I will say, like, we definitely embraced English much more smoothly. Let's say, not without its own hiccups, but more smoothly than you have with the Greek context. I think in part because the Hellenism is bound up with national identity, right? You have a flag. I'm looking at like pictures of kids with a Greek flag, right, in the streets of American cities. We have no flag, and I think that gave us a little bit of an advantage in America, in a sense. But also, I would say, like my daughter, who's we would say half white, half Arab. She's 12. We're visiting, my hometown, the church, the cathedral there. They're getting ready for a Lebanese dinner, and she wants to cook with the ladies, getting ready for the Lebanese dinner, right? You got Greek Fest, they have Lebanese dinners. And the majority of the ladies cooking the Lebanese food for the Lebanese dinner are converts to Orthodoxy. And they've completely embraced like Antiochian, Arab Christian culture, right? So there's been this kind of retaining, and we have converts beating down the doors of our churches. And not to say we don't have problems. I think our loss rate of youth is probably comparable to in the Greek world, in the Greek American world. But I think, there is something perhaps to learn from some of the other Orthodox jurisdictions. Why are there more converts coming into Antiochian churches and not as much into Greek churches? There's got to be an answer. Are we doing that at the sacrifice of our culture? Or are we integrating these converts into Antiochian culture? I think more the latter than the former, because a lot of these people are pretty into being Antiochian. Like, they're not OCA. They're Antiochians, and they like being Antiochians, and they've embraced a lot of the cultural.
Thank you, Matt. That's great, actually. I'd like to hear a response. Do you have a response?
I have to agree with the connection between Hellenism and nationalism. It's a structural one, because we have still challenges. Greece as a country is still, although it's been unified and it's got its borders, northern Cyprus is occupied. It's only been 100 years since we remember the Archbishop being killed on the streets of Smyrna. Yes, we still have this nationalist element in our identity. Call it nationalist, call it patriotic, call it ethnophilitism, whatever you call it. We've got that kind of Greekness is still. There's still something there, there's an intensity, which Lebanon has its own issues, but it's not the same, I think.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop this because I really want to get to the reception, but I want to say thank you. I think we can continue this downstairs. I think that's better. So let's thank. Thank you very much, Professor Kittrowith. And thank you all for coming. And there is a wine and cheese reception downstairs, so please stay and let's continue this conversation downstairs. Thank you.